So this is a video by the Holy Post where they're talking about Christian nationalism. They're talking about what it is, what it isn't, how it compares to Christian conservatism. This is kind of a big topic in American politics. It's important in the political world and in the Christian world, and a number of these Christian YouTube channels have been covering the topic of Christian nationalism. So I'm going to play these clips and I'm going to make some comments on it. By the way, if you like what I'm doing, please be sure to click the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you'll leave a comment below, I'd really appreciate it. I love reading the comments and responding to them. And yes, that is a dent in the top of my microphone. It was up on a high shelf when we were preparing for a possible flood. Thankfully, that flood did not get into our house, but there was our equipment up high and the microphone fell, hit the floor, and that's what happened to that. Okay, I'm going to get started now.
The notion of a Christian America itself is anti-Bible, anti-gospel. So, I mean, you're starting it. So I'm like, okay, great. Great, but I still see them both as entirely wrong.
Yeah, this is actually a conclusion that I came to myself several years ago, that there's really no point thinking about the religious identity of a nation state. It doesn't go along with anything that we know from the New Testament, and it doesn't go along with what we know about the history of the United States. So as a Christian, I feel no need for there to be a Christian America, or an America with a Christian history or a Christian founding. Christianity is something that happens within the individual, within the church, and its practice wouldn't even lead to governments or nation states.
It's wrong to be a Christian conservative. Is that what you're saying, Carl?
If the vision
Clearly,
of Christian conservatism, if the vision of Christian conservatism is a Christian America, then yeah, that is.
So in this video, we have Phil Vischer there at the top, Skye Jethani on the left, and I think this guy whose name is Carl is a guest on their program. Now, he's making some good points, I think. Is he taking it too far? What do you think about that? Is it okay to even contemplate or have a goal of a Christian America? He's saying, no, that would not be a Christian thing. The way I see it is that by following Christian values, by following the laws of Jesus and the instructions of the apostles, you would never end up with a country with borders and laws and governments and police and military and a tax system. Those things do not come about from following the New Testament.
An America formed by Christian values.
Yeah, you cannot have a Christian nation state defined.
No,
you cannot define Christianity and nation state and say that those two things belong together.
Right, but you can have a nation state that has Christian character, that is charitable, that is that seeks the good of others.
This is an interesting point, and I've wondered about this myself. Like, does God see countries the way that he does individuals? You know, we're used to a lot of Old Testament prophecy where God speaks to an entire nation of people. He talks about their sins, their virtues. He calls people to repentance. He talks about what their future will hold for them. Now, of course, there's a lot of difference between what was considered a nation back in those times and our modern idea of countries. But there is a degree to which a modern country is a community of people. And in that way, we certainly influence each other to do good or to do wrong. And perhaps on some level, God does look at these groups as being more or less righteous as a whole. But I'm really not entirely sure on that point either way. But if we are to consider countries to be Christian or non-Christian, or to have Christian character, as Phil Vischer calls it here, I think he puts out some good criteria for that. How does that country act in accordance to the commandments of Jesus, as Phil says here, in seeking the good of others, as that's kind of the key point of Christian law. So if the united goals and laws and trajectory of a country is towards seeking the benefit of others, then maybe we could at least say, well, this country is showing a good example as far as countries go. Now, does that make it a Christian country? Does that mean, yes, you can have a Christian country? I still don't think so.
No, that ceases, no, to make anything a nation state. Nation states are governed by boundaries and the threat of force.
And this is something I just can't really get over. I don't have a good answer to this. Even if a country is doing good as far as countries go, even if they have good domestic policies, people are being taken care of through a welfare system, if they're protecting people's freedoms, if they have a good immigration policy, they're bringing people in and helping them, even if they're doing all kinds of good things that line up with the commandments of Jesus, at some level, there's still a system of judges and wardens and policemen. And at some point, there are people who will do you bodily harm in the name of that country's laws if you step out of bounds. At some point, there is going to be enforcement through deprivation of freedoms or bodily harm that will be done for the preservation of that country. So that, in my opinion, pulls countries right out of any possibility of being truly Christian countries. And I think that's the point that Carl is making here.
I mean, you can say, yes, there are parts of a nation state's charter that reflect the kingdom. Sure, absolutely. And you can have nation states where loads of people are Christians, but to say a nation state itself can be Christian is to totally misunderstand what it is to be Christian and what it is to be a nation state.
I think he's absolutely right there. You know, there's just things about what make a country what it is that aren't going to line up with Christianity. Like Jesus tells his disciples to not seek dominion over each other. I mean, right there, you've kind of made it impossible for Jesus's followers to found what we would consider a country today. I think there's contradictions between Christianity and nation states that just can't be reconciled.
I want to take this last paragraph and then I want you both to respond to it because there's something in here. Christian conservatism has mostly been a populist movement mobilized by parachurch groups and leaders. Christian nationalism is more intellectual and has far fewer adherents. But its intellectual prowess enables it to insinuate itself into post-liberal wider circles. Okay, and there is a growing post-liberal movement. Heavily on the right, but also somewhat on the left, we see it as well.
So at this point, they start talking about the difference between conservative Christian politics and Christian nationalism in politics. Now, to be honest, from my point of view, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. It seems to me like just a new name on a lot of the right-wing policies of the past. I think there's a lot of people who want to consider themselves conservative Christians politically, but they don't want to be considered part of the MAGA movement. They don't want to be considered Donald Trump supporters. But in my opinion, there is a continuity from the 90s through the 2000s up into more recent years. So many attitudes and the manifestations of those attitudes go back decades, and there's been a continuity through the decades up through today. But a lot of conservative Christians who are active politically look at the MAGA movement of more recent times and they don't like what they see and they don't want to be associated with it, so they need some way to express their differences.
Christian nationalists sometimes disparage traditional Christian conservatism as failed and archaic. Christian nationalism is newer, shinier, more provocative, and brasher. Christian nationalism proudly strives actually to become what critics falsely claimed about Christian conservatism, that they want to take over America and turn it into a theocracy.
Okay.
And take away religious freedom. Okay?
I remember back during the early 2000s, I vividly remember Christians talking quite openly about the benefits of the invasion of Iraq and the way it was bringing Christianity into Iraq. A lot of conservative Christians talked the same way about George W. Bush as you hear conservative Christians talking about Donald Trump today in some pretty wild, far-out ways, connecting the president to Bible prophecy and some wider vision of Christian goals. But there's something about the Donald Trump era that makes a lot of people look for some good old days, and I think there is some revisionism at play to strengthen the idea of a good old days period where there was just good plain Christian conservatism that wasn't like this new and undesirable Christian nationalism.
Skye, you have thoughts? Skye?
Okay. Yeah, I have many thoughts, Phil. And as far as strictly differentiating these terms and how they've been historically defined, I think the article is accurate. Here's my problem with it. I actually listed the different traits for each one. I wrote on my little legal pad here.
Oh.
So he argues that Christian conservatives are for limited government and that Christian nationalists are for expanded government. But when you look at the trends, just take Christian out of the equation. Just talk about conservatism versus what's happening with the MAGA movement. they're no longer for limited government. They're also for expanded government. He also said Christian conservatives are for free markets and immigration, whereas Christian nationalists are anti-free market and anti-immigrant. Conservatives were for the U.S.'s international engagement in the world, sort of anti-communist, intervention, whereas Christian nationalists are isolationists. They don't want to be in Ukraine. They don't want to be involved in Gaza and in Israel. He said Christian nationalists support the Constitution and democratic ideals, whereas Christian nationalists are anti-Constitution and anti-democratic ideals. Conservatives were anti-strongmen. They believed in democracy and voting, whereas Christian nationalists are pro-strongmen. And the big one we keep going back to is conservatives favored traditional liberal values like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of that. And nationalists are illiberal. But when you look at the direction of the conservative movement writ large in this country, they are all moving toward the things he lists as Christian nationalists.
So the author of this article that they're discussing seems to have made a list of things that he likes and things that he doesn't like. The things that he likes, he's put in the bucket of Christian conservatism, and things he doesn't like, he's put in the bucket of Christian nationalism. So again, I think a lot of this is a bit meaningless and also a bit revisionist. It's an attempt to have a viable, desirable Christian conservative political movement that is not connected to Donald Trump and the MAGA political movement. But it runs into a problem because then you have to say things about the past of Christian conservative politics that just really aren't true. And you have to say things about the present that just aren't going to make a lot of sense to people, like saying that Christian conservatives are in favor of immigration. Now, I know specifically that, yes, there are Christian conservatives who are in favor of some of the things listed there, like immigration, for example, but by and large, the Christian conservative political movement as a political force has not changed much on these issues over the decades. They were in favor of building walls on the border and deporting people back in the early 2000s, and they continue with that same attitude today. They've been in favor of censoring media, whether books or movies or music, that they consider to be against Christian values, going back as far as I can remember, at least, and I'm only 39 years old, but it's certainly not a new thing that so-called Christian nationalists have come up with that Christian conservatives were never in favor of. So I think the author of this article wants to have it both ways, does not want to be connected to Christian nationalism, but then wants to put things that he doesn't like into that bucket while reimagining a Christian conservative that entails things that he is in favor of.
Strongmen, illiberalism, bigger government, anti-immigrants. Okay. So what he's basically saying here is he's comparing the religious right from like 1990 or 2000 with the Christian religious right today looks way more like Christian nationalism than what he's calling Christian conservatism. So I understand the media mixes these things up, but they're describing what they're seeing.
Let me say something and tell me if you agree or disagree with this. Mike and or Carl, do you agree or disagree with this? Is he really just describing the difference between conservatism and nationalism, Christian or otherwise? And what we've basically got is Ronald Reagan is conservatism, Donald Trump is nationalism.
Yes.
And then we're adding on Christian just because.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, in the 1980s, Reagan was a conservative and a bunch of Christians wanted to support him, so they adopted conservative views. Today, Donald Trump is a nationalist and a bunch of Christians want to support him, and so they are becoming Christian nationalists. That's exactly what's happened.
Interesting.
Yeah, Phil, that might be one of the smartest things you've said.
Thank you.
I mean, recently.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I try not to set the bar too high.
Well, I have to admit that some of this does certainly go over my head, and I really appreciate this discussion that these guys are having here. It's certainly an interesting phenomena of our time. Some of this goes back from before my time, so I'm not entirely familiar with the whole history of Christian conservatism, Christian nationalism, but please let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about this video, about this discussion between Phil and Mike and Brad, and tell me what you think about my comments on it. I look forward to reading them, and I will talk to you again later. Bye for now.